Welcome to Teachers Talk Texts, the podcast where English teachers share their insights and interpretations of texts currently studied in BCE English. I'm your host, Claire Mackey. Let's dive into today's episode. So I feel like I can kick off with my very first question to you, which is that what is it? And I know we've kind of just talked about it, but that's fine. I'll ask you anyway. What is it that you love about Station 11?
I love how entertaining it is in terms of the structure of the novel, in that I often think about the fact that it begins with, Arthur's death on stage during King Lear, and that seems to be this point where everything kicks off from, and I think that's such a fascinating way to start. But there was part of me that was thinking that maybe the dinner party scene could have been where they started it off, and I often think each time that I read it, because of that sort of disjointed structure and that jumping around and how much you learn as you go through it, it really makes it rewarding on that second and third reading. And I think as teachers, we're often telling students, you need to read things a second and third time. And there's so many things that you pick up on those subsequent readings. But particularly with this, I find it, every time I read it, I see something else that, with the knowledge that I have from that second and third reading, you realise how many things are there early on. And I know that, even things like, with Tyler and the Prophet, the first time that I found that out, I had like a physical reaction. I was like, oh, it's him. And then when you read it that second and third time, you realise like, oh God, I probably should have picked up on it.
Yeah.
It's all these clues along the way.
Yeah.
But I love that about how it gave me pause to think about. I love the premise of that it sort of gets us to think about our own lives and that it is this contemporary, sort of text where, it's sort of based, I'd say loosely in sort of 2016, 2017, I think, or when it was published, 5 or 6 years ago. And so it's that idea of being able to consider how we organise our lives now, how we go about these things. And obviously, when I was telling other people that I'm reading a book about, a flu that wipes out 99% of the world's population, I'm like, well, that's a bit dark. But obviously there are very dark and haunting moments to it, but I think it's very uplifting as well. And that's one of the things that I love, that there are those sort of life-affirming moments. And even if they come about in tragic ways, when it's about people realising what they've lost or what they didn't take, what they did take for granted, I should say, in that connection that they had to other people and those small moments of joy and so on. I think that, as a reader, you're reading it thinking, well, okay, that's what I'm going to take from it. That's what I love from it, trying to pick out those small moments of joy and those types of things. And so I also love the interconnectedness of it and the structure. I love things like the paperweight and those little... and I really love that idea of the dinner party, like I mentioned before, that everyone's there. Even Jeevan, as the photographer, is out there. And it's that one scene that for me sort of ties the whole novel together, in that there was this one moment in time. And then even at the end, Clark talks about, as he's reading Dr. 11, this is like in the last sort of 10 or 15 pages, and he realises that Miranda had drawn that scene of the dinner party, and he understands that he was there and he was once with all those people around that table under electric light, I think it says, or something like that. And so there's that idea that that's that point when all these characters were together, and then we get this understanding of where they all go. And I think that's, really, really interesting to consider, that connectedness of everyone's lives and those things that we might not have even realised when we were around these people that we've met before, or that everyone has these lives going on, that I think is fascinating. And you can keep sort of going down the rabbit hole with that and thinking about it. There's a word, somda, which is basically that moment where you understand that you feel like you're the main character of your own life, but you have this understanding that everyone else is walking around and they're the main character in their lives, and you're just a bit player. You're the person who was at the airport with them. You're the person who was behind the counter at the supermarket, or whatever it might have been, and that we all play these very small and probably insignificant most of the time little roles, but that everything has to work together. So I think, for me, it just opened up so many thoughts about how we organise our lives at the moment, and what we see as purposeful in our lives, and really asked so many questions and posed so many questions when it came to, well, what if all of that was blown up tomorrow, figuratively, in terms of, what if all of it came to an end, what survives and what doesn't?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the thing that went through my mind as I was in the early stages of the text was, so like when the electricity goes out, my mind said, well, why does it go out? Is it not automated that it just happens? And then I think good readers research as they read, and so I hopped online and had a look, and I realized no, it's not these things that we assume every time we click the light on. The light will turn on, and we assume every time we turn the tap on that water will come. These things are all processes that are human driven, and if they're physically are not the humans to drive those processes, they stop. But yet we take these things completely for granted, and it would never occur to you that perhaps one day, and I think, is it Kirsten? Kirsten reflects on that one day, she remembers walking into a room and flicking on a light and there just being light there, and that was just so normal, and that feels so maybe like anachronistic to her now, because that's just not what's possible. But coming back to this idea of purpose, I like this idea that in the post Georgia flu world, it's interesting. It was interesting that theatre and art and performance and Shakespeare exist on both sides, in that Arthur was performing Lear and then they're performing Shakespeare, and that quote survival is insufficient, which is not Shakespeare. Was it Star Trek? Still canon, in depending on, give it 100 years. But yeah, this idea that even if we do survive something like that, there's still an impetus to perform and to give and to connect with others, and that the travelling symphony put themselves at risk in order to achieve that. I thought that was, that resonated with me. People are living.
The idea that art and beauty and all these things that survive it. And even though there's obviously, and I think Mandel really points that out with the fact that she says that, they were performing A Midsummer Night's Dream, in a parking lot. And she talks about, the costumes being these, sequin dresses that they managed to, ransack from other people's houses. So it's this very much, put together, sort of stuck together sort of performance, but it still has such importance. And she mentions, I think, someone in the front row, crying, and that idea. And I think there's so much there to think about in terms of when it says, people wanted what was best about the world. And I think that's so, that comes through so strongly when it's that idea of, okay, so that's why there's Shakespeare, because it's that, not that there's that way that we go back, oh, he's the best, but that idea that, an extremely well-known, playwright, a very, very popular playwright and all that. And so that's what survives. And they talk about things like, I think it's, new arrangements of pop songs and things like that. It's that reminder of what was there and what was best about the world. And that I think, particularly as you said, with the survival is insufficient. One thing that I sort of saw throughout the whole novel was this idea that there are this idea of survival, and then what exists above it, what transcends survival, what makes life worth living. And I think, you can even see that early on when Jeevan's at the supermarket on the night when he's received that phone call. And so the first however many trolleys are, water and all these staples and these essentials that, what is survival based. And the last trolley's made up of things like biscuits and fruit and these perishable items, but like that sweetness, that idea that it's like, well, we've got to take care of the survival, but that's not what life's about. We're not just here to survive. And that last trolley are all these luxuries, these things that will eventually go. But so it really, I think, sets up that idea that what Mandel's saying is this idea of, people having this sense of surviving, but being able to find more in life and how important that is to people. So I think, there's plenty of that in there. But I think, obviously the Travelling Symphony show that off, exceptionally well with, with the work that they're doing and why they feel that they need to do it for themselves and what the people of the towns get from it.
Yeah. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that progression in the trolley in that way, but I like that yeah, you're right, he does. He goes staples first and I think, does he reflect at one point that was the last, is it him who had the last orange, that it was the last orange he'd ever eaten,
I think it's
And
Clark. Yeah, Clark thinks back to that. Yeah, and he's thinking of dancing with Arthur, and then he talks about, he's had his last orange. And it's that idea of these small things that are, but the little things are the big things. That's a bit of a cliche, but it is. I think there is so much of that in that, and I find it really interesting throughout. Just recently I reread it again and I started taking note of there's a lot of these sort of disjointed sort of incomplete sentences that Mandel puts in, and I'm trying to think of a few of them off the top of my head, but they're things like, Miranda gets this joy out of walking cold city streets with a warm coffee in her hand or something like that, but that's all it says. It's just this disjointed sentence out of nowhere. And then Clark talks about things like, the pepper tree or the Brazilian tree in someone's backyard, and full stop. And then it's this list. And so it's like this idea of just these memories that come to them of what all these very small things that are actually the things that they, long for and yearn for in this world where all that luxury has been, taken from them. Yeah.
Or the scene when they're in the, Kirsten and another girl are in the house and there's the tea set, and they take this little kid's tea set with them because I guess that, it's a complete luxury, as if you have the space, if you're traveling constantly, to be carrying something that has no other purpose than for imaginative play. But that's still so important in this post-flu world where you're literally surviving every day. We still need to foster our creative, our imaginations.
And I mean, you can couple that with the paperweight as well. Like they talk about how the Kirsten carries it around, that it serves no purpose. I think the quote is even that it's a dead weight or something like that Mandel points out. So it's this idea that even though it's not there for function or for practicality in terms of this is going to help us survive in this new world, it's that you still need to have those things, that it's not just about survival, that there is this room and there's this need even for things that are beautiful and things that, that give you hope or give you that sense of joy.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it's fair to say that would be one of her main concerns in the text, is about what is it that we value in our life, and encouraging the reader to reflect on that, on what we give value to.
And personally, I like, I was lucky enough to teach this in the classroom for a couple of years, and I liked taking that angle quite often because I think, there's so many texts that we teach, throughout all year levels, but particularly to year 12 that, they're not always the most uplifting. A lot of the time a lot of the texts are, tragic and about adversity and so on. Of course, there's a place for that, but you want to make sure when you're talking about this with young people that it's not all just doom and gloom. I think it's really important to point out, well, actually there are some messages here that are quite affirming and quite uplifting, and that's really something. So that was always, I think there's plenty of evidence to support it, but it was personally, I think when I was talking with year 12s about how to access it, I think it's also a good way of being able to see it and to take something, personally from it as well.
Yeah. But there is a very clear message. There's a very clear view and value, something that she's valuing. So thinking about our year 12s in accessing this particular text, as you mentioned, there's so many characters, and there's all of them who sat around that dinner table, but there's more characters even than that. Do you have a view on who the protagonist is? Do you think we need to view this text with one protagonist? I just wondered, just occurred to me how, how students might start breaking down who's important, is that question answerable?
Yeah, it's been, it's something that for this year, I'm putting together a study guide for it for students, and I'm sort of following that sort of traditional structure of keeping notes about characters and so on. And it really did bring up that thing. I nearly put in a section that said, minor characters, but in that way, it's like, well, in some regards, they're all minor characters, and in the way that they're all major characters. It's really hard. I think the first time that I read it, I had that understanding that Arthur was the person that was at the center of everything. But the more that I read it, the more that I discuss it, I don't feel that way anymore. And I think, we probably fall into that way of thinking, probably because that's how the novel begins. And we're probably used to, all right, well, whoever's there at the beginning of the novel, that's who's important. But by the end of the novel, both, chronologically in terms of the events of what happens, but then also structurally how the novel ends, Arthur's nowhere to be seen. It's 20 years after his death. And so it's, then you turn to Jeevan and you think, well, this must be his story, because it starts with him and that feeling that he gets when he leaves the theatre, and you think, okay, this is about this man's journey, and he survives. So surely if he's on both sides of it, but at the same time, there's so much that has nothing to do with him there in the middle, and all those scenes, with the travelling symphony and so on, are pretty removed from him, even though they're taking place at the same time. So for me, I find, that's a really classic English teacher way of giving an answer without giving an answer. But for me, for me, I think personally, I found that there are three characters that I can really get a lot out of in terms of what I think Mandel's saying through them. And I think Arthur is the tragic character of all of this. Arthur is the one who realises on the eve of his death that he's done it all wrong, that he's missed it. He's missed that connection with his son, that he has looked for happiness and purpose in all these pursuits, and none of them have led to any sense of contentment or anything. So I think there's so much that happens with Arthur. And then I think Miranda and Jeevan, I think obviously are really important, but particularly Miranda, because I think she's one of the few characters, even though we have this pre and post collapse world, she's one of the few characters that really changes because of herself, not because of the world around her, but she reinvents herself, and that she, has that, abusive relationship with Pablo, and she's able to leave him. And then she realizes that she's not going to find happiness with another person, and that this relationship is not what's going to give her that sense of purpose. And even in that pre-pandemic world, she has the courage to go and find a sense of meaning for herself in her work. Which I think is really, really interesting, and a really key idea, that she doesn't find that purpose necessarily in other people, but rather what she finds for herself. And so I think there's plenty that we could think about there. But the third major one for me, other than Miranda and Arthur, is Clark, because he has the regrets perhaps that Arthur has, and that he comes to understand that he might have been one of those zombies, that he might have been one of those people who was, minimally present in his own life, and that the work that he was doing wasn't inspiring him. And rather, as opposed to Jeevan, who has a chance to remedy that and find that purpose in the post-collapse world, he just has those years to consider it and to lament the fact that, he missed out on all of those things. And I think that's tragic in its own way, but he's such a likable character, Clark, and that he's able to see that about himself, and that, I think there's so many ideas that run through him as well. So, I think that in my personal reading, those three are the ones that I get the most from in terms of what I understand the novel to be about. And they're the ones that I can see the most through. But then, of course, I'm sure there'd be plenty of people thinking, well, what about Kirsten? She's got that link between both worlds, and Jeevan has that link between both worlds. So, of course, there's a lot there, but they were the three that really stood out for me personally in terms of, how I'd be looking at the text in terms of, what they represent and what they embody.
And I think the way, I suppose, if someone said, Arthur and Miranda don't exist past the flu, in some ways they do, because you mentioned the paperweight and that the symbolic nature of that, and that it was Arthur's, and that I suppose in that way you could argue it has echoes. He echoes throughout the text. And then also with Miranda, with her, with Station 11, the comic, and that how much impact that has post Georgia flu. So in some ways, that argument that a character doesn't necessarily need to be physically present for them to have like impact or to catalyze events in the narrative. Thinking about coming back to Tyler, and obviously he was very impacted by Station 11. For bad, I guess, for evil, whereas Kirsten was more for good, like that yin and yang. They were both similar age before the flu came through. I'm just writing all these characters down and trying to create a little map for myself in my head, as I think it's always good to do. But you're right, there's so many.
You hit the nail on the head with the fact that they're the same age. That's something that I feel, we need to be, pretty sharp in the way that we think about it. But in that idea that it's like, all right, if they're both of a similar age at the collapse, what is it that they clung to that allowed them, and what is it that led to Tyler becoming such an abhorrent character? You know, he's this awful person who manipulates and murders and abuses, and that Kirsten is able to, you know, essentially, you know, provide good and for the world in terms of beauty and so on. And so we'd see her as a character who is able to have the strength to, you know, find some purpose, but also to be what we'd consider a good character, and someone who's able to take those same things that were given to her. And so I think there's so much to think about when it comes to the two of them. And as you mentioned, they both have that link to the Dr. 11 comics, yet Tyler interprets it in this way that leads to this very, you know, warped view of the world and the way that he views things, and Kirsten takes it in that other way. And so they're able to take those similar experiences and living through that experience, yet the way that they react to it is so vastly different.
Oh yes, Dr. 11, not Station 11, Claire. I'm doing well. You know, it's you know what I meant.
Exactly.
On that this may be a big question, and sorry to just throw it at you, but is it reductive enough to say, and this is from a first reading too, I think you've made a very fair point. I think I do need to, and I would encourage anyone listening to this, go back and read again, and I think I will, if I ever want to discuss this text again. But Tyler turns to religion. Well, the Bible, at least. I don't know if I could say religion, because he turns to a text, and that text is the Bible. Whereas Kirsten turns to another text, with Shakespeare. You know, both written word, both from a long time ago. Do you think Mandel's making a commentary about religion? Is that too a black and white?
No, I don't think that's too reductive. I think that there's, you know, my understanding of Tyler is that that it may not so much be a comment about just religion itself, but rather, you know, for me, it's that desperation, and the people, because, you know, Tyler might have these thoughts and so on, but there are these band of people that follow him. And so for me, it's more of a warning. And I know what you mean. I'm sure that there'd be plenty of people that could read it and say, oh, this is, you know, an attack on religion, and an attack on organised spirituality and all these types of things. But I see it more as that when people are placed in these situations, that there's plenty of people that are essentially, you know, yearning for this sense of purpose, and to know, well, why is it that this has happened, and that there is this choice, I guess, that's put forward, that in this new world there is, you know, there is, you know, love and understanding and connection and art and beauty and these positive things that we can choose to find our meaning in, and or, you know, what we can contribute for others and so on, and how Jeevan wants to be seen as this, you know, that he's not quite a doctor, but, you know, that he can be this healer in this new world and so on. And we see that as very positive traits in this way of finding this, as opposed to those very negative traits that, well, I'm searching and I'm scrapping for meaning here because what has happened is just so incredibly bizarre. But to see that as, okay, this is part of God's plan, and that it was there to cleanse the earth and all those types of things, is that way of taking that in that extremely negative view that's going to be hurtful to other people. So rather than it being directly about religion per se, I think it's really about that idea of, you know, the dangers of people sort of scrambling for meaning in a way where they see it as you know, an opportunity for them to manipulate and to harm others, as opposed to those who are going to work with others and try and find, you know, beauty, joy, love, connection, those types of things.
So yeah, that's I like that, very insightful perspective, because Tyler wants so much for there to be, well, I'm extrapolating, or, you know, imagining, you know, some form of bigger purpose to the Georgia flu, and he does, you know, with the way that he speaks and the way the sort of kind of the lines that he uses and repeats, and that his followers repeat, suggest this idea of a greater purpose, whereas perhaps Kirsten is more about the individual, and just, yeah, that finding of individual sparks of joy, and that, she doesn't tend to blame, in reflection on, you know, it just is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And And even with so many people around her having died and her losing her brother, but she's relatively kind of unimpacted by that. Because she could have turned the same way as Tyler. She's had a, in that year of her life that she lost as well, and she doesn't remember. The brain is a very, very impressive organ in protecting us. And so I guess the suggestion is that something very horrific would have happened to her if her brain
first year
is not allowing her to remember as a protective mechanism.
I think that's really interesting in terms of that. We can see Tyler's actions as disgusting and awful and so on, but when you sort of take away that judgment and try to take a look at, well, why is it that he turned out that way? That disconnect with his father, a mother who was telling him, everything happens for a reason, and she even says that at the dinner party, before he's even conceived, her view of the world was about, everything happens for a reason and all those types of things. And she keeps repeating that in the airport. And you look at that and you think, amongst all of that, I think, is he 7 or 8 years old at the time of the collapse? Amongst all of that, well, this is what that led to. That if we have all these thoughts, if we have this child go through all of this, well, this is what can happen. And I always think I really wanted to jump on that point that you made, because it's something that I noticed as well, that I think there are those parallels between Kirsten and Tyler being the same age. And those different ways. And I think the way that we've sort of, discussed that is a really great way for students to think about it, because we don't just want to be, Kirsten equals good, Tyler equals bad, but it's that idea of, well, both of them take very different journeys. And why does it end up that way? And that's where that real thinking can be. We don't need to be as direct as, good or bad or positive or negative. But rather thinking about, well, why is it that way, and what can we get from that?
Yeah, even as looking at them, I'd kind of my brain wants to make a Venn diagram, because I think that's a really effective way of comparing and contrasting two characters, because there is a number of things that are similar, but there's also a number of things that are different. And then perhaps considering, so what is Mandel saying? Kirsten is part of a group. She's supported by, and there's a leader within that, and because she's young, you want to have someone to hopefully help and guide you as a young person, whereas Tyler becomes a leader as a young person, and so I guess from that there'd be some interesting kind of I can imagine an interesting comparative paragraph considering what message she might be promoting.
And how much of that is impacted by what has happened to them? You start to think about that sort of nature and nurture sort of argument. But I found it really interesting that when Miranda is in the Arthur's dressing room and Kirsten's a child and she's colouring on the ground, I found it really interesting that Mandel points out that Miranda's thoughts are, she's this precocious child, she's been coddled. She'll grow up to be this, I can't remember the exact words, but it's pretty scathing. It's basically, and she says, she begins to remember why she didn't like child actors. So Kirsten as an 8-year-old is this, sort of, I guess, entitled, precocious, sort of bratty kid who feels like she can just waltz on into Arthur's dressing room and do what she wants. And it's interesting that Miranda points out that she's coddled and all these things, because of course what happens is the exact opposite of that, and that she's thrown into this and she becomes this very self-sufficient, person who has, got the tattoos on the wrist to signify that she's had to kill 2 people, and that these things have happened to her, and she's become this person who can take care of herself. She's not who she was seen to be when she was 8. And I think, that opens up so much in terms of how we think about, well, is it the person or is it what happens to them? And I think a step further to Tyler and to Kirsten, it's always interesting, and it's pointed out at what point of their lives people were at when the pandemic hit. And, do we teach children, that argument that Jeevan has with the people in the New World about, do we need to teach children about what the world was like? And Kirsten mentions, I forget her name, but there's a younger member of the Travelling Symphony, and it says that she's growing up in a a softer world or something like that, and that hopefully she won't have to kill. And that it's this idea that, okay, because that she was born, you know, later and she's younger than Kirsten, that perhaps she won't go through those same things. And so, yeah, there's plenty of that, I think, as well, that we can open up so many questions when we look at what point of someone's life were they at when the pandemic hit, and how has that you know, made things for them, and you know, that leads obviously to, you know, is it better to remember or to forget, and you know, the more you remember, the more you lost, and all those types of things. But I think there's a lot there that we can talk about character in terms of, well, what impact does it have on people? Does it reveal people's character? Does it, you know, what impact does it have on all of those people?
That's so true. That's so, and even there was some children, I think, in a town that they weren't being taught. They just didn't speak of so these children didn't even know that there was, or there had been a world before the world that they knew, which is totally possible in this post-flu world, I suppose, if the adults, seems like an M. Night Shyamalan film to me, but
it does a bit, doesn't it?
Like, you know, but I think, I feel like Mandel, sometimes it's hard to bring out what you think in text as complex as this, what she's actually saying. But perhaps with that ending, that hopeful ending with the lights on in the town, is there a subtle suggestion that she would advocate for knowledge over ignorance, even if that knowledge comes with pain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find that whole ending, in terms of that being there and Kirsten being so excited by the electricity. Yeah. I think, like what you said with trying to find, you know, those values and those ideas that she's trying to get across. I think any students that are looking for that, they need to remember that there's not one answer that they must get to, that it's about an interpretation, that it's okay to put that interpretation forward. If you've got evidence to support that, and that's your analysis of what you think the text was about, then that's completely fine. It's not a case of, no, you're wrong if you think that. And I think the electricity that you talk about, it seems to be such a sign of progress. You know, they talk about Kirsten remembers, you know, flying over New York as a child, and that's one of her only memories. And it talks about, I think the quote is, a sea of lights. And so there's that idea for me that light and electricity and electric light is this sign of progress of a society that has got to a point where it can have light. And as you said, if that's a symbol of enlightenment, that we are connected, we share knowledge, we have all these things, and that and one of the things that Jeevan first notices when he first ventures out into the world is the absence of electric light. And that really stuck with me, because it was this idea of, okay, of all the things that are clear about the pre and post pandemic, this idea that there is most definitely a world with light, and then this world where the first thing that he notices is the absence of electric light. And then by the time we finish the novel, there is hope because there is light. Well, that would lead itself to a pretty, I think, clear point that perhaps Mandel is talking about the wonders of technology, that it's a necessary thing for our society, that we will return to those types of things. But there's also plenty of counter evidence as well, where it comes to things like, she mentions that the stars above that area are more dim, that the sky is more dim above that area that has found electricity and so on. And so I think there's also plenty of evidence for a student to say, well, there's technology that has an impact on the natural world. You know, when that plane takes off for Los Angeles, they all comment on the sound and the roar of the engines. And so for me, that really spoke to that we have this natural world that is invaded by technology, by jet engines and light. And it talks about it was the end of the era of light pollution. And so, yeah, I think there's all these ways when you throw it all into the blender and try to get an answer out of it. I think, well, we've got to just tease out how we see that there's both sides to that coin, that technology is this interrupting, distracting force, but at the same time, it provides us with so many things that make life bearable, that make life enjoyable. And so, you know, we need to see it for all of those things.
I like that. What my brain went to as well with that absence of electric light was with the Dr. 11 comics, and how the absence of light is such a key kind of symbolic element And I think, I mean, there's many parallels between those comics and what happens as we go through. Not just that Miranda used, locations in her actual world and Earth to design, but just I think there's so many lovely parallels there, and light maybe is one of them, because Clark at one point I think is reading later on in the novel when Kirsten gives him one of the comics and then goes, and she's going to come back and swap so that one of them is safe at all times.
That's right. Yep.
And I think that's when he comments on the absence of light in that room. You're right, there's so much light, and I mean light as a symbol or motif in text is, can mean so many things, which is lovely. It gives us such a wide variety of interpretive frameworks to use. You've got not just electricity, but knowledge. Often that light bulb, can mean knowledge, or those in the light are those in the know, those who understand, whereas those in the darkness are perhaps
I like what you said before about it being, that allusion to enlightenment, because that's something that I hadn't really considered. But as you said that, I was thinking about how they talk about the blank laptop screens that that once were filled with light and so on. And you think, as you said that, I thought, I hadn't considered that idea of light is symbolic of that, enlightenment and knowledge and the ability to think and all those types of things. So for me, I think it's really important. Often when I'm talking to students about these types of things, it's like, I think often they want the equal sign. It's like, okay, I've read it, I've seen all these things. She mentions light all the time. What does that mean? And so, for students, I'm always big on them saying, well, what do you get from it? And that it's never, light equals, this, and it's symbolic of this. Light can be symbolic of, plenty of different things. Yeah. And it's even used, as we said, there's plenty of evidence to suggest it's about enlightenment. There's plenty of evidence to suggest as well that it's about what's artificial and not real. That lamp that's next to the pool at Arthur and Miranda's house. Yeah. And she talks about how, because of the smog of LA, she can't see the actual moon clearly, that the reflection of the lamp off the pool is coming through much more clearly. And I thought, what does that mean? In terms of, what she's seeing and what is coming through more clearly to it isn't what's real, it's what's fake, it's what's ingenuine. And that led me to think more about how on her initial, the start of her relationship with Arthur, she says something about she thought they were lying in the moonlight, but she realized it was the electric blue light from outside. And so again, it was this idea of, she felt like this was genuine and authentic and everything, but perhaps there wasn't. Perhaps this, wasn't that deeper connection, that she thought that it was. And I think, I just realized
that's awesome that Mandel was foreshadowing that in that first. And if it's a blink and you miss it moment, you wouldn't.
And there's millions of them throughout the text, and that I really enjoy that. And it's so often it's blue light. It's this idea of the iPhone zombies, and he was just Jeevan is distracted by the blue light off his screen and so on. And so there's just so many different ways, I think, to interpret that light, and all those like you said, blink and you miss it things. The first people that Jeevan comes across, I think they're called Ben, Abdul and Jennifer or something like that, but he says he could see in the firelight that their faces were worn. And so it was like, okay, so now we don't have electric blue light, we've got firelight. Yeah. What does that mean? Is this a natural thing? Is this truly revealing what these people were in that time, that, perhaps these, depictions of light being either artificial or natural suggest what Mandel's trying to tell us about what we can interpret about that character, that this is who they truly are, or this is what they thought they were, but really it wasn't, it wasn't the case. So there's plenty in there, I think, to think about every time that light's mentioned and what it might mean. And if students might be listening to this and thinking, oh, that's not how I saw it. And, I'd always be encouraging them to, well, how did you see it? Because there's a million different ways that it could be seen. But just knowing that she hasn't just thrown it in every 3 or 4 pages for the fun of it, that, we can find some meaning there, but it's not going to be an equal sign. It's not going to be, light is this, light can be many different things, I think.
Yes, no, I agree. And it's not, black and white the way we sometimes want things to be.
That's right.
Or sometimes I always really want to get the authors like meaning. Like I feel like it's like a puzzle and a jigsaw. I want to work it out. Sometimes you can't. And I think maybe that's the beauty of literature. Maybe they weren't going in with any sort of really clear, specific intent. They were just wanting to pose some questions to the reader or make us reflect on our lives, which I think she has done. The one thing I thought of then with that, he's saying, so the electric light versus the natural light, I'd argue that the people in the text who have a better understanding about what life means and what is important in life are the ones that live in the post-electric world, and they have no light. So that then counters that whole argument about, being able to see, or does it support it? You could go in either way. That, when we had knowledge, when we had, a phone at our fingertips that we can look up whatever we want, or we can click a few buttons and call someone halfway across the world. When we had that connection and that knowledge, we actually didn't know anything. And then when we lose it, we discover, and yet we don't have light. But
there's so much to think about. Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just my brain is starting to just, which I love. This is it makes me want to go through and then highlight every single example of light in the text, maybe in 2 different colors, and then track it. That would be
think about how it works that way. I think probably one of my initial reactions was when the flu takes out all technology and everything, and we revert back to this. I think an easy interpretation would be to go with, okay, then we're back to who we truly are as human beings. But then Mandel also throws in like that poor girl at the airport who's looking for, I think it's a Fexor, which is an antidepressant.
Yeah.
And you think, okay, well, there goes my argument that, the flu brought with it this purity and this return to what was real and everything like that, because there are people who rely on the technologies of the modern world. And so... Or
insulin. There was a few diabetics.
Yeah, exactly.
Who died because...
Her brother dying from stepping on a nail, and she talks about, there being no antibiotics and so on and other things like that. And so you think, oh, okay, it can't be as simple as technology bad, return to what was there is good. There's both views of that. And that, there's that thought that's there about, perhaps there's something that's in between.
Yeah. And maybe is that, maybe her argument that we need to have a better balance, a healthier balance, maybe need to stop looking at things in artificial light all the time, but not maybe completely switch it off, maybe just occasionally.
That's right. Yeah. And that's the whole thing with technology as well, that it's, that there is that distraction and the iPhone zombies and all those people, but then there are the positives of technology that are outlined as well. So yeah, I think as long as students that are studying it are looking at it without trying to find, as you said, that black and white answer before, that it's okay to be able to, that when they're writing if they're writing analytically about it for the exam and for their SACs, that it's about the ability to be able to show your interpretation of it. And so you can present that strongly with all of your evidence and all the ways that you've seen it, but you don't have to come to, right, this is exactly what Mandel was saying in terms of something being good or bad. She celebrates technology whilst also outlining the dangers of people's reliance upon it. And that's fine. That's okay to get to that without there having to be, it has to be good or bad. Yeah. Because I don't think it's a bit like when we talked about with religion and so on before. Yeah. For me personally, I don't think there are many, bold one way or the other sort of comments, from this novel. For every point, there's a counterpoint, like we said before. And so that should definitely be part of the interpretation, I think, that students are trying to find from it.
I agree. And it would arguably make a more nuanced argument. Argument. But yeah, I think it's okay. Students should feel empowered to present the shades of grey in an argument. You don't necessarily have to be, obviously you have to answer the essay topic, which, that's, you can't just say, I kind of will talk about the essay topic and something else. No, we have to talk about the topic, but within that topic, we can definitely, drill down a little bit and engage in those shades of grey while we're discussing. I agree. I'm just going back to the questions that I like to, because I feel like this conversation's just gone great guns, but I haven't been, not that I really have a plan, in all honesty. We have talked about Mandel's, you know, what she intended to achieve, or what her purpose may be in the text. But maybe we can come now to why you think Station 11 is important, and why perhaps the VCAA popped it on the list. I mean, they were a bit forward thinking. They didn't know we'd have a global pandemic. As you said, it came on in 2018. So just wondering your thoughts on that.
I think particularly for young people reading this, I think there's plenty that they can get from it in terms of looking at who are the successful characters, in terms of what we judge as being someone who has that sense of contentment and that sense of you know, being happy with the way that their lives turn out. And so I think through that, through what some characters regret, through what some characters savor, through what some characters find, there's that, I think, really important message about you know, the characters that are most aware of themselves, who have the most self-awareness, in my interpretation of it, are the ones who have the most success, in that they are aware of what it is that will give them joy and contentment and so on. And Arthur is the antithesis of that. He goes chasing it in all of these places, and he's restless. He's never, you know, he talks about being homesick, but never wanting to go back to Delano Island. He talks about, you know, Los Angeles, that he loves it, but he hates it at the same time. And so he's this restless character, and, you know, the 3 divorces and all those types of things that are constantly brought up, that he just pivots from one thing to the other, trying to find this. And by the end of it, he's just this empty, you know, empty vessel who's got nothing in terms of that contentment. And so I think for young people you know, reading through that, I think there's a lot that they can get from that in being aware of who they are and what brings them, you know, a sense of purpose and so on. And that we see probably Jeevan and Miranda as more successful in what they are able to do. On top of that as well, I think there's so much in there that talks about our relationship with authority. And I think that's a really great thing for, you know, for year 12s to be considering, in that, you know, who is it that we, you know, put our trust in? And the prophet obviously is this horrible example of that gone wrong, that there are these people that are desperate for a leader, that there are these people in the world who are followers, and what that leads them to is being a part of this cult that manipulates and that you know, works through fear and all these, you know, horrible things. And that also leads, I think, to that idea of self-sufficiency. And I think I've read somewhere about Mandel being inspired because of Hurricane Katrina, and that idea that there are these people in New Orleans and so on that were thinking, you know, the National Guard will come, the government will come, and they never did. No. And, you know, so I guess it's a really great thing for year 12 students, you know, who are about to go out into the world, you know, post-school, whatever that might be, whether that's further study or a career or whatever it might be, in thinking, well, you know, we have this sort of layer of protection in the Western world, where we have this idea that, you know, underneath all of it, there is this safety net of government and authority. But what if that's not there? And what happens there? And you know, we need to have that sense of self-sufficiency. So that, for me, you know, really brings up that, I guess, that questioning of how we live our lives now. And that's why I fell in love with the premise of the novel from the first time I read it, because it's that really intriguing idea of saying, like, okay, let's take a contemporary sort of view of the world, you know, 2016 or 2014, whenever it was written, you know, it's still contemporary enough. Let's jump forward 20 years and look back at, you know, a world where you could press a button and a satellite would connect you to someone else and so on. And what does that lead to? And how do we interact with technology? And does that come at the expense of one another? And for me, a lot of that leads to, I think, why it's important is that one of the prevailing messages for me was, you know, that idea of human connection, that so much of it is that's what it's about. And we learn that in a positive sense from Jeevan having this family in the post-pandemic world and this sense of purpose and that contentment that he gets from it. And that we learn that tragically through, that's what Clark misses. You know, he looks back at baking with his mother and his father beaming in the front row when he was a child. And those things that, when literally everything else is gone, that's what he has. He has very little physically there with him, but the things that he remembers as he's talking about all the rubbish that he used to do with his job and the circling around and all those terms he used in the corporate world was all just junk. It was detail, and the thing that came through was baking cookies with his mother and the memories of Robert doing a crossword in bed or perhaps over breakfast or something like that. It was all about those moments with someone else, and I think that a lot of people reading it could get a lot out of that in terms of thinking about how they're going about their own lives and what might come through there. I know personally that's what I got from it in trying to consider, okay, where is it that I would fit in if this was me, in that pre-pandemic collapse, and what is it that I'm doing? What would I regret, or what am I glad that I've celebrated, and all those types of things.
It does provoke that sense of self-reflection, which, in what are we doing with our lives? What's our purpose? What are we wasting our time doing, perhaps? And then she's not criticizing us, I don't think, she's just saying, hey, reader, are you, if you have to look back at your life, if your life ended tomorrow, would you have, I mean, we're all going to have a little bit of regret, sure, but would we be, on that scale of regret or joy? Did we have more of one or the other? I think you brought up that idea of authority, which we didn't really get to today, but contextually for when students are listening to this, which will be in a little while, we've just had this situation in America with the storm on the Senate. So I think, this idea about democracy and our trust in democracy being absolute has been maybe challenged a little bit in the last, well, not just the last week, but I think especially the last week or so for all of the world in looking at one of the arguably strongest democracies being challenged a little bit this week.
And Mandel mentions that with the travelling symphony and the different towns that they move through, and that some have established local governments and they have mayors and things like that they're trying to go back to a democracy. And I mean, that's interesting that you bring that up with everything that's happening, in the US at the moment. You could talk about that as well with Tyler, that this is not a sense of democracy or an elected government or representative governance or anything like that. It's a personality, and it is a symbol that people follow. And that brings up a lot, I think, in terms of people that are desperate for order, and where they find that, and the dangers of following. It's going to sound like a pun, like false prophets, but that idea of it's a personality and a symbol that they're following, not an idea of of democracy or anything like that. There's plenty in there to unravel with that as well.
I think so. I think students studying this text in 2021, it feels very weird to say that, but we're in the first week or so of 2021 right now. We'll have many different kind of contextual points to access this text that perhaps students in previous years haven't. And for that, I'd be very, I think they'll do very well in engaging with this text with some form of, I'll come back to that idea of lived experience. That's how we access a text. We come to a text with our own worldview. And so students will have a little bit more life experience perhaps than a regular year 12 may do, or a pre-COVID year 12 perhaps, to access this text in a really meaningful way, which is fab.
I found that last year. I started filming YouTube videos on a range of different texts, and when I was doing the Station 11 videos, I was in my garage. I was, I put a mask on as a bit of a prop, because I was thinking, how odd that I'm talking about this world, but I was doing that as a project, in the fact that I couldn't go more than 5 kilometres outside of my own house in the middle of this pandemic. Here I am talking about this book and making these YouTube videos. So it was, it's really, I think there is that link there for students to be able to dive right in with what they're seeing and happening, and how those things have that actual human impact, and now to consider it through text and what that might mean.
Yeah, no, I agree. Now, on the topic of these YouTube videos, Ben, you should tell us about about the English Lab, because that's kind of how we connected, is through social media and through the English Lab, and what you've been doing for the last, well, you said last 12 months or so?
Yeah, the last 12 months. So, I have taken a little break from the classroom, and so I started a little project called the English Lab. So essentially, it's a lot of working with different schools and their English departments, which I really, really enjoy, and sort of helping out English teachers and so on at different schools around the state. But then with COVID last year and not being able to travel to schools and so on and do those types of things, it sort of pivoted towards, providing things for students as well. And so I've started a YouTube channel. It's just called the English Lab. And so I've really enjoyed that part of it. It sort of came about through COVID in that I thought, I know all of these texts, I've read all of the text, I've produced a practice exam and all those types of things. So I may as well put some of that knowledge, to use in creating these YouTube videos. And it's been really fulfilling for me because one of the things that I found difficult was leaving the classroom. I love teaching English. I particularly love teaching Year 12 English, but it's been so nice to be able to create these videos, and then the interactivity of students being able to post questions in the comments of YouTube videos and so on, and still being able to link with students that are trying their best to understand all these things has been really, really cool. So I'm looking to build on that this year. Hopefully the YouTube channel will get bigger. I'm putting forward a few study guides. Station 11 will actually be the first one. So hopefully that'll be ready to go by February of 2021. But other than that, a lot of that sort of work with students and sort of doing teacher training and so on when it comes to texts, the comparative texts or the Section A texts and argument analysis, a lot of VCE work as well in working with different schools and helping them come up with really great ways of teaching these texts, but also working with students. So it's really great fun and doing things like this. I really enjoy, being able to talk about all these things and to work with other English teachers. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And the fact that I can, make a living out of doing it is something that is really, really cool. So it's been fun. The 2020 was obviously a heck of a year to start a business. And to go out on my own, but we got through it, and I'm hoping to keep things going in
this year will be easy then, right? If
yeah, well, let's hope so. Touch wood.
I'll put some links to the English Lab in the show notes because I know how to do that now.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed our conversation, and as it happens every time, I know that we probably only really skimmed the surface of all the possible things, but I still think there was lots of really interesting. I still don't feel that I've come to terms yet with the text. It needs to sit with me a little bit longer. Maybe I need to read it again to
Most definitely, I think, and I think that's always a sign of a good book when there's still things that you're grappling with, after having put it down. But yeah, thanks very much, Claire. I've got a lot out of it. I really appreciate your time. It's been fun chatting about it, and even. Through talking with you and seeing some of the different ways that you saw it and some of those things, it's really cool. So thank you.
No, my pleasure. Absolute pleasure. This was fun. If you liked today's episode and you'd like to support me to continue making these pods, you can jump on to Buy Me a Coffee just to support the podcast and help me invest in new and exciting technologies to make this podcast better. There's a link in the show notes, and I would really appreciate any support you can provide just so I can continue this wonderful thought experiment. If you haven't already followed us on Instagram, we're at Teachers Talk Texts. Would love you to jump on and ask any questions you have after this episode, and let me know what you're interested in and what you'd like to hear from in future. If you have questions, texts you'd really like to see covered, definitely jump on and let me know, and have a wonderful day. Bye.